Story number 1. The house that never goes dark. I still remember the first night I noticed it, the strange glow from next door that wouldn't go away. Even at 3 in the morning, while the rest of our suburban block lay cloaked in quiet darkness, that single house remained ablaze with light. My name is Daniel Moore, and I've lived on Cedarwood Drive for almost 8 years. It's not the kind of neighborhood where unusual things happen. Nobody moves here expecting dark secrets lurking behind neat lawns and picket fences. Most folks are friendly, if a little dull, and once the sun goes down, the only sights are porch lights and the reflection of street lamps on parked cars. That's why the always lit house stood out so sharply, like a beacon in the gloom. At first, I assumed something mundane. Maybe the family inside simply forgot to turn lights off or were away on vacation, leaving them on as a deterrent to burglars. But as the night stretched into weeks, I realized that the light never shifted. In fact, it grew more unsettling the closer I paid attention. From my upstairs bedroom window, I could see the second floor of that house clearly. Certain windows glowed with a steady, almost unnatural brightness that flickered occasionally, like a television set left on with no one watching. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed shadows darting past, but it happened too quickly to be sure. Once or twice, I considered strolling over just to knock on the door and see if everything was okay. But there was something about that unwavering glow that made the hair on my arms stand up. It reminded me of a dead person's grin, wide, unchanging, and empty. It's embarrassing to admit, but I'm not exactly fearless. I always lock my doors, double-check my windows. I hate horror movies. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. Who in their right mind kept every single light on through day, night, and day again? On the rare afternoons I was home from work, I'd pass by that house, noticing the blinds drawn tight. If I listened closely, I heard nothing, no hum of a TV, no muffled conversation, no footsteps. I didn't even see a car in the driveway. One evening, a couple of months after the lights first caught my eye, I happened to catch our mail carrier in front of that property. I asked if he delivered many packages there, hoping to glean some info. He shrugged and said, "Nobody's picking up the mail. Boxes stuffed. I might have to send a note back to the post office." Then he gave me a curious look, like he suspected I was prying too hard. I let the topic drop but walked away feeling uneasy. If no one was collecting mail, who was inside flipping the switches or leaving them perpetually flipped? Another few weeks passed. By that point, the house had become the talk of our street. Old Mrs. Parker from down the block said she'd known the previous owners, an older couple who sold the place a year ago, but as far as she understood, the new owners never officially moved in. A for sale sign had been posted once, then vanished. No one had glimpsed a moving truck, nor had anyone local spotted tenants out in the yard. Yet every window remained lit. Eventually, a handful of us neighbors milled around near the mailbox after work. "Should we call the cops?" someone suggested. "Might be squatters." Another asked if we should call the power company. But nothing ever came of it. We were all too polite, or maybe too afraid of stepping on invisible toes. That was how we rationalized it, anyway. "It's not our house," we told each other. "They'll handle it if there's a problem." So we let it linger as an oddity, a conversation starter, half joke and half local legend. But it wasn't a joke to me. My bedroom window faced that place, so I stared at it each night. And each night, the glow seemed to intensify, until my curtains couldn't block it out completely. I had nightmares of wide-eyed silhouettes framed in bright windows, beckoning me closer. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the clock reading 2:54 a.m. or some equally unholy hour, that same glow creeping around the edges of my blinds. Finally, my frustration overcame my fear. One rainy Saturday, I resolved to figure out what was going on. If the owners were truly absent, maybe I could peek through the windows from the backyard. Just a quick look, enough to quell my curiosity or give me reason to call the authorities. A drizzle swept the street as I approached the house. Its lawn was unkempt, grass overgrown. The porch steps looked warped by neglect. Yet the windows burned with that unwavering brightness. I was surprised no circuit had blown or light bulb had burned out. My heart pounded as I climbed the front steps. The boards creaked under my shoes. I told myself I'd just ring the bell, see if anyone answered. If not, that was it, I'd be gone. I pressed the doorbell. No sound. I tried knocking. The echo in the hallway beyond was hollow, as though the place were empty. But the lights overhead in the entryway, two decorative sconces, shone through the frosted glass of the door. The weird thing was, no shadows. Normally, light behind frosted glass shifts if someone moves around. But it remained static, unnatural. I stood there in the drizzle, goosebumps rising on my arms. I tried the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. To my shock, it turned. The door clicked open with a hushed scrape. Instinct screamed at me to leave, but something stronger, curiosity or stupidity, pushed me across the threshold. My breath caught. The foyer beyond was brightly lit by a ceiling fixture. Every other light I could see from here, table lamps, overhead bulbs, was also on. Yet the place smelled stale, like dust and old wallpaper. No sign of habitation. The furnishings appeared minimal, a small table with a mirror above it, a coat rack without any coats, some scuffed hardwood floors. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing up a staircase to the left. No answer. The house practically hummed with electricity. Lights from a living room spilled across the floor, flickering though multiple lamps were battling for dominance. My heart hammered so loudly I heard it in my ears. I took a step forward. The front door slipped from my hand, swinging shut behind me with a faint thud. I jumped at the sound. "Calm down, Dan," I muttered to myself. "This is probably just an abandoned house. People forget to turn things off. Nothing weird here." But my own words rang hollow. I edged into the living room. It was furnished with an old floral couch, a dusty rug, a coffee table. Every lamp, there were 4, one in each corner, blazed at full brightness. An overhead chandelier added to the glare. Yet no footprints marred the dust on the rug. A cold draft brushed my ankles, though I saw no open windows. My gaze drifted to the walls, pale wallpaper with faint stripes. Picture hooks, but no pictures. Something about that emptiness gnawed at me. If this was someone's home, where were their personal touches? Books, photos, anything? And who needed so many lights in one room? I tried a switch on the wall, flicking it down. The lamps flickered out for a split second, only to surge back on. I frowned, flipping the switch multiple times, but the lights refused to dim. My scalp prickled. I tried unplugging one of the corner lamps. The moment the plug left the socket, the lamp's bulb flared in my hand, scorching my palm. With a yelp, I dropped it. That lamp kept shining, cord dangling uselessly. My entire body buzzed with fear. This was no normal electrical setup. "Hello!" I shouted louder, adrenaline sparking. "Is anyone here?" Silence. Then, from somewhere upstairs, a faint click. Like a door latch, or maybe a lamp being switched on. The hackles rose on my neck. I glanced at the staircase, trying to steel my nerves. If someone was messing with me, I'd let them know I wasn't playing along. My mind conjured images of squatters, deranged ex-owners, or some poor soul trapped. Summoning courage, I headed toward the stairs. Each step creaked. The overhead light in the stairwell was painfully bright, forcing me to squint. My reflection in a hallway mirror looked pale, eyes wide. I felt like I'd stepped into some alternate dimension, a place where lights were alive and logic no longer applied. At the landing, a narrow corridor led to 3 doors, all closed. Light leaked from beneath each threshold, so intense that it cut lines across the floor. My gut twisted. I started with the first door on the right. Turning the knob, I pushed it open. The bedroom beyond was drenched in light, an overhead fixture, plus a desk lamp, plus a standing lamp by a bare closet. My eyes watered from the glare. The bed lay neatly made with floral sheets, pristine except for a thick layer of dust. On the bedside table sat a single photograph in a frame. I approached, half expecting it to be blank. Instead, it showed a family, a mother, father, and 2 kids in front of a Christmas tree. Their faces were somewhat blurred, the colors washed out. The father had the kids on his lap, the mother leaning close, all smiling. My chest tightened. This was someone's home once. I touched the photo's frame. A static jolt zipped through my fingertips. Grimacing, I set it down. Then I realized the overhead fixture was swaying slightly, though no breeze was in the room. A long, low hum filled the space, barely audible, like an electrical whine. My teeth vibrated. I spun, intending to leave, when I saw something move near the closet door, a small orb of light, the size of a baseball, drifting in midair. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from a lamp. But it moved with purpose, zigzagging near the floor, then rising higher, swirling in small loops. I froze. The orb glowed a soft white, and within it, I thought I saw flickers of a human outline, arms, a face contorted in shock, like an afterimage burned into an old TV screen. My mouth went dry. I took a step back. The orb zipped across the room, passing through a lampshade without, casting a shadow. Then it sank into the floor and vanished. "No," I whispered, heart pounding so hard it hurt. "No, no, no. This was impossible. Lights weren't supposed to float around on their own." I wanted to run, but a compulsion urged me to check the other rooms. I needed to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. So I left that bedroom, trembling, and tried the door across the hall. Another bedroom, similarly lit to a blinding degree. More dusty furniture, more signs that no one truly lived here. I saw orbs again, not just one but multiple, swirling by the ceiling like fish in an aquarium. They were different sizes, each flickering in a rhythm that made me think of breathing. A choked whimper escaped my throat. I couldn't accept what I was seeing. But then one of the orbs dipped near me. Within it, I glimpsed a woman's face, translucent, mouth open in a silent scream. Her eyes locked onto mine for a split second before she dissolved back into shapeless glow. I stumbled out into the hallway, my vision swimming. I'd read about ghosts, will-o'-the-wisps, spook lights. Never believed in them. Yet here I was, surrounded by them. Terrified, I turned to the last door. It must be the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. A strip of harsh light blazed beneath it. Something about that door felt worse than the others, as though it radiated a heavier dread. Maybe this was where it all started. My legs shook, but I inched forward, pushing the door open with the back of my hand. An immediate gust of heat struck me, like stepping into an oven. This master bedroom was bigger, with an attached bathroom. Lights beamed from overhead fixtures, wall sconces, even a vanity mirror's bulbs blazing around its edges. So bright I had to shield my eyes. But through my squinted gaze, I saw half a dozen orbs swirling at various heights. They glided near the four-poster bed, which was stripped of bedding, just a naked mattress with dark stains. The orbs moved in a slow, choreographed pattern, weaving in and out of each other's paths. Their flickers created a strobe effect on the walls, like a silent disco of trapped lights. Bile rose in my throat as I realized that the stains on the mattress looked brownish red. Dried blood, perhaps. And near the foot of the bed, a shape crouched on the floor, flickering so rapidly that it appeared translucent. At first I thought it was just another orb, but then I saw limbs, a torso, long hair. It was a woman, or the ghost of a woman, collapsed on her knees with her back to me. Her entire form glowed, as if lit from within. I should have run. But I found myself taking one shaky step closer. The figure twitched, as though stuck in a loop. She reached an arm up to the bed, her mouth moving silently. Then her body jerked, and she crumpled again, repeating the action over and over. An endless cycle of anguish. My mind screamed, this is what they do. They're reliving their final moments. The woman rose, or half rose, then fell, each time with the same motion, as if a record were skipping. Finally, I couldn't bear it. I stumbled backward, nearly colliding with the doorframe. That's when I heard a faint voice behind me, another orb, drifting in from the hallway. It hissed a single word in a breathy whisper, like wind through a crack. Trapped, my spine turned to ice. I spun to face the orb. Within its glow, I saw a young boy's face, maybe 10 years old. His eyes pleaded with me, then flickered out. All around me, lights shimmered, orbs flitted. Some repeated a gesture, reaching out, turning a doorknob, pressing hands to their chests. Snippets of final actions before they died. My stomach lurched with horror. The electric hum grew louder, a claustrophobic crescendo. I had to get out of there. I whirled, running for the stairs, ignoring the swirl of lights that bobbed around me. They seemed almost frantic, trying to communicate. But my terror overrode any empathy. I sprinted down to the foyer, nearly tripping over my own feet. The door was still unlocked, so I yanked it open, burst outside into the drizzle. Clouds churned overhead, and for an instant, the neighborhood seemed the same as always, quiet, normal. Then I glanced back. Through the windows, I saw them, dozens of glowing shapes, drifting from room to room as though searching for something. Some pressed against the glass, their faces smudged like reflections. In that moment, I realized the truth. The lights that never turned off weren't just random bulbs left on by absent owners. They were these souls, these echoes of people who died in that house. For whatever reason, their final moments were captured and replayed, fueling the electric brightness. The entire property was a trap, sealed in perpetual illumination by ghosts who couldn't rest. I fled, half expecting something to grab my ankles. Rain soaked my hair as I stumbled across the yard, heart pounding so loud I thought it would explode. Once I reached the street, I noticed an old real estate sign lying half hidden by weeds, reading under contract, with a phone number faded by time. I didn't care to investigate further. I just wanted to be away from that cursed place. That night, I barely slept. The image of the woman in the master bedroom haunted my dreams, looping forever in a moment of death. The next morning, I did call the police. Told them the house was suspicious, that it might be full of squatters or something worse. They humored me, said they'd send someone to check. Days passed with no update. The lights remained. Whenever I dared to look from my window, I saw that bright, perpetual glow, a silent beacon of sorrow. I tried to speak with neighbors, but they looked uneasy, as though afraid to question the phenomenon. I considered contacting a medium or a paranormal investigator, but my pride got in the way. Who would believe me, anyway? Then, one late afternoon, I spotted a police cruiser parked in front of the house. Relief warred with dread. I peered through my curtains, watching two officers approach the front door. One knocked. No response, obviously. Then he tried the doorknob, just like I had. They disappeared inside. For the longest time, there was no movement. My nerves jangled. Finally, one officer emerged, his face pale. He exchanged hurried words with his partner, who followed with a dazed expression. Neither stayed long. They jumped in their cruiser and left. That night, the lights continued to blaze, no difference from before. I never learned the official police explanation. Rumor had it they filed no report or concluded the house was vacant. All I know is, after that day, I never saw another patrol car attempt entry. A week later, a small notice appeared on the front yard, demolition scheduled. The county or some private developer must have decided to raise the property. Perhaps the city took ownership after taxes went unpaid. The neighbors whispered that it was going to be torn down in a month. Part of me felt relief, whatever haunted that place would be destroyed along with it. Another part of me wondered if the restless souls inside could really be set free by bulldozers and wrecking balls. The night before the demolition, I couldn't sleep. The lights in the house still glowed like a final stand against oblivion. Around 3 a.m, I heard a faint noise from outside, like wind chimes in a storm. Peering out my bedroom window, I saw orbs drifting across the yard, weaving in and out of the fence line. It seemed they knew what was coming, some final exodus, or a protest. My breath hitched as they hovered near the sidewalk, shifting like a slow, sorrowful dance. Then they receded back into the house. Dawn broke. Crews arrived with heavy machinery. Neighbors gathered behind caution tape, me among them, watching bulldozers crawl forward. The workers approached the front door, crowbars ready. But before they could pry it open, an officer on site told them it was already unlocked. The men nodded, stepping inside to ensure no vagrants were present. They emerged moments later, both looking rattled, exchanging uncertain glances. One said something to the foreman, who shrugged. I heard snippets. Lights won't turn off, no sign of an electrical panel. The foreman snapped that they should cut the main power line from outside. They did. We all heard the distinctive pop of circuits being severed. Yet the windows remained lit. My stomach turned. The foreman mumbled something about possible independent generators. But soon enough, the bulldozer revved, metal treads grinding forward. The blade slammed into the front wall. Plaster and wood gave way. The watchers let out gasps. I held my breath. Clouds of dust rose, drifting across the street. Under the relentless power of machines, the roof caved in, walls collapsed, each beam snapping with thunderous cracks. The lights, unbelievably, stayed on until the entire structure toppled. Even as the second floor fell in a roar of splintered wood, I could see flashes of brightness flickering among the debris. Then, gradually, the house was reduced to rubble. By noon, the lot was a smoking ruin, dust swirling in the air. The bulldozers ceased. The foreman walked among the rubble, guiding workers who hosed the site to keep dust down. In that swirling haze, for just an instant, I saw an orb flit upward from the wreckage. Then another. They soared like embers, drifting skyward. A swirl of them rose, bright even in midday sunlight, until they disappeared into the clouds. My eyes stung. I realized I was crying. Nobody else seemed to notice. They were busy talking or taking pictures. Maybe I was the only one who saw those lights ascend. I can't say for sure. After that day, the lot stood empty, a patch of dirt fenced off until further construction. Night fell, and for the first time in months, my street was dark again. No perpetual glow. But sometimes, when I stare out into that empty lot, I recall the flicker of those orbs, the looped gestures of ghosts trapped in their final moments. I wonder if they found peace in the end, or if they merely scattered, carrying their anguish elsewhere. Neighbors rarely mention the house now, as if it were a collective fever dream. But I can't forget. Late at night, with the streetlights casting lonely pools of orange, I think about that strange electric hum, the sorrowful eyes of the spirits who locked onto my gaze. I remember the woman on the floor, repeating her death-like dance, and the boy whispering trapped, in a voice like wind. I have no answers, only a deep-set fear that some tragedies don't simply vanish with a bulldozer's blade. That house wore the souls of its victims like a cloak of living light, an endless replay of horror. Maybe the teardown freed them. Or maybe ghosts never truly leave, they just find new corners of darkness to illuminate. I'd like to believe they're at rest, far from that cursed property. Yet every so often, in the hush before dawn, I spot a flicker in the corner of my eye, drifting near my fence line, gone by the time I blink. I tell myself it's a trick of the street lamp or a reflection in my bedroom window. But a small, uneasy part of me wonders if something lingers still, bound to the last place it knew. And if that's so, then perhaps all we did was tear down walls while the bright but anguished echoes remain, swirling just beyond our sight, waiting to be seen again when curiosity or darkness draws them out. I've never told anyone the full truth. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But if you should ever pass an abandoned house that seems alive with light, no matter how comforting it appears, think twice before you enter. Some lights are not meant to be switched off, and some souls remain where they died, forever searching for a way out. And if those lights shine too brightly, it may be their silent plea for release, a plea only the living can deliver, at a cost we might not be prepared to pay. Story number 2. The Never-Leaving Neighbor. My name is Daniel Ford, and for most of my life, I'd never lived next to anyone truly mysterious. People move in and out of suburban neighborhoods all the time, but when my parents decided we should leave our cramped apartment and buy a house on Oakwood Drive, I didn't expect to find anything more unsettling than squeaky floors or a leaky roof. I was wrong. We moved in during late summer. The sun was hot, the grass already turning yellow in places, and our new house seemed perfect, 2 stories, a big yard, and a garage large enough to hold my dad's endless boxes of tools. Across the fence stood another home, older and slightly run down, but neat enough that my mother was glad not to be facing an eyesore. The man who lived there, according to the realtor, was an elderly gentleman named Mr. Goodwin. Apparently, he'd owned that house for decades, rarely left, and paid all his bills by mail. The realtor called him harmless. But from the moment we arrived, something about that house made me uneasy. The driveway was choked with weeds, the shutters peeling. We never saw Mr. Goodwin come outside to wave or chat, never saw him amble to a mailbox. The windows stayed shuttered, and the only sign of life was a small porch light that glowed even at midday. Dad joked that the man was probably just a recluse, someone who preferred the quiet. But the first time I set eyes on that porch, I felt a chill prickle the back of my neck. I couldn't say why. It was just a stoop of cracked concrete and warped wood, empty except for a single rocking chair that never seemed to move. Then came the nights. We'd only lived there a week when I started hearing a noise around 2 or 3 in the morning. At first it was faint, like scraping, or maybe something rolling across the floor. I'd wake up, heart pounding, trying to figure out if it was the wind or a cat rummaging in the trash. Then I realized it came from next door, from Mr. Goodwin's place. Over time, I pinpointed the direction. It originated down low, as if from his basement. It wasn't consistent, more like bursts of sound, a clang of metal on metal, a dragging noise, a muffled thud, then quiet again. My parents insisted it was probably an old furnace or pipes. But the tension in their voices revealed they heard it too, and found it equally unsettling. Days passed into weeks. School started back up, giving me something else to focus on. Yet each time I walked home, I noticed Mr. Goodwin's curtains drawn, his front yard unkempt, leaves accumulating on his porch. No sign of him stepping out to grab groceries or even water the sparse shrubs. Meanwhile, the nighttime noises grew louder. It was impossible to ignore. Our living room faced his house, and sometimes, around midnight, we saw a faint glow in his basement windows, like a single dusty light bulb flickering. Dad once mused that maybe the old man was tinkering with a project down there. But Dad never mustered the courage to walk over and ask. We were too polite, or maybe too spooked. Our curiosity grew until, one Saturday afternoon, I decided to at least knock on Mr. Goodwin's door. Dad agreed. He wanted me to see if the old guy needed any help. Mom, though, got anxious about the idea, wanting me to be respectful and not push too hard. I trudged across our lawn, unlatched the short gate that separated our yards, and stepped onto Mr. Goodwin's front walk. The air seemed cooler on his property, a stagnant hush that pressed on my ears. I saw no footprints in the dust of the porch, no sign that anyone regularly crossed these boards. A solitary spider web clung to the railing, glinting in the sunlight. I forced myself to knock gently. Knock, knock, knock. Silence. I knocked again. This time, the door cracked open under my knuckles, unlocked. My stomach twisted. Mr. Goodwin? I called, leaning forward. The interior was dim, a hallway stretching back into shadows. The smell was stale, like a room sealed for years. Hello? I repeated, louder. No response. For a moment, I nearly stepped inside, but an overwhelming dread stopped me. Instead, I gently pulled the door shut and backed away, pulse hammering. Returning to my parents, I told them nobody answered, though the door was unlocked. Dad frowned, glancing at the house. Maybe the old man's out, or asleep. We can try again tomorrow. But we never did. The next night, the basement noises were louder than ever, scratching, banging, a dull moan of metal that set my teeth on edge. My bedroom faced the other direction, but I still sensed it. Sometimes, I'd press my ear to the wall of the upstairs hall, trying to catch the faint vibrations. It felt like the house next door was breathing, exhaling pain gasps into the night. My sleep worsened. Schoolmates noticed I looked tired. But I kept quiet about it. Telling them I was spooked by an old neighbor's house would have sounded juvenile. One evening, Mom told me she'd called the local community center to ask if they knew anything about Mr. Goodwin, like if he had a caretaker. They only told her that Mr. Goodwin was on record as the homeowner, taxes paid in full. No emergency contacts. Dad threatened to call the police for a welfare check, but he hesitated, worried about intruding on an old man's privacy if there was no real emergency. Days turned into a month. Fall arrived in full force, leaves drifting across the yards. Mr. Goodwin's porch grew cluttered with them, untouched. The basement noises turned nightly, consistent as a heartbeat. Some nights they were mild, like distant rattles. Other nights, the cacophony was strong enough to wake us all. Mom, bleary-eyed at breakfast, would comment that it sounded like someone was dragging furniture over concrete. Dad started making remarks about how we should do something. Then an odd event happened. I saw Mr. Goodwin. It was after school on a cloudy afternoon. I'd come home alone. Mom was running errands, Dad still at work. I was in my room, opening the window for air, when I noticed movement in Mr. Goodwin's backyard. My heart leapt. There, at the edge of his property, stood a stooped figure. He wore a threadbare cardigan, his head bald and spotted with age. His back was to me, but I knew it had to be him. I leaned out the window. "Mr. Goodwin?" I called, voice cracking. He made no sign of hearing. His body jerked in small, stiff motions. At one point, it looked like he was pulling something from the ground, maybe a weed. But the movement was so mechanical, so abrupt. Then he turned slightly, giving me a glimpse of a profile, a pale face, mouth slightly open. I realized with a jolt that his eyes were shut or sunken. A second later, the figure jerked out of sight behind the corner of his house. That was it. No conversation, no wave, no sign he even knew I was there. When Mom got home, I told her I'd seen him. She asked if he looked sick. I shrugged, describing his odd posture. She frowned, looking uncertain. Dad, upon hearing, decided that was it. He was going to knock again, with me in tow, and make sure the man was all right. That evening, we marched to Mr. Goodwin's porch. The door was locked this time, though Dad tried the knob. He pressed the bell, hammered on the wood. "Mr. Goodwin," he yelled. "We're neighbors, just want to check if you're okay." Nothing. The house remained silent. As we left, Dad peered in the front window. He murmured that the interior looked empty, coated in dust, with no lights on. Puzzled, we went home. That night, the basement rumbles sounded even closer. I woke around 2 a.m., heart pounding, the sheets damp with sweat. I listened, certain I heard muffled voices, maybe even a cry. I convinced myself I was dreaming. But the next morning, Dad mentioned hearing something like a soft scream. Mom was pale, refusing to meet our eyes. Something was very, very wrong in that house. Another couple of weeks passed. My parents were more on edge than ever. Dad muttered about calling the authorities, but he always found an excuse not to. One day, while rummaging in the attic for holiday decorations, I found an old newspaper stuffed in the corner, left by the previous homeowner. By sheer coincidence, it included an article referencing the old houses on Oakwood Drive. One paragraph mentioned a rumored tragedy involving a man named Goodwin. The date on the paper was from 20 years ago. The article was vague, hinting at strange circumstances, but no details. My gut twisted. That night, after dinner, I showed Dad the article. He read it with furrowed brows, then did something bold. He marched next door, alone, while Mom and I watched nervously from our window. Dad pounded on Mr. Goodwin's door again, shouting, "Sir, if you're in trouble, please let us help." The only answer was the wind-rattling old shutters. Dad tried the door, locked. He circled around back, out of sight. 15 minutes later, he returned, face stony. The back door was open, he whispered to Mom. I stepped inside. That place is deserted. Dust everywhere. It's like no one's lived there in decades. Mom gasped. Dad continued, voice trembling, I found the basement door. It was locked from the outside. I swear I heard something down there, but I couldn't force it. I got spooked and left. Mom asked if he saw Mr. Goodwin. Dad shook his head. I don't think he's in there. That same night, we heard the loudest commotion yet, like chains dragging, and a series of dull thuds that made our walls tremble. Around 3 a.m., I sat upright in bed, convinced I heard multiple voices moaning. My breath hitched in terror. Then, just as suddenly, it went silent. The next morning, Dad was determined to call the police. We were done messing around. He dialed the non-emergency line, explained the situation, an elderly neighbor possibly in distress, weird noises, no sign of normal life. The dispatcher promised to send someone by. Late that afternoon, a patrol car showed up. We watched from our living room as two officers approached Mr. Goodwin's house, tried the bell, knocked. They eventually let themselves in through the back, presumably the same open door Dad had found. We waited, hearts in our throats. After a while, they emerged, looking puzzled. We saw them chatting on the porch, then leaving. Dad hurried outside to flag them down. The officers told him they'd found nobody inside, no furniture except dusty remnants. "The place is empty," one said. "We'll file a report, but it seems abandoned. We might track down the owner to see if it's a code violation." Dad pressed him about the noises. The officers shrugged, suggesting maybe raccoons or an old water heater. They left, unconvinced there was any immediate danger. That night, the noises returned. Now the fear was so thick, I couldn't concentrate on homework or anything else. Every squeak of floorboards made me jump. Mom looked hollow-eyed, barely sleeping. Dad paced the house, muttering about what to do. The police had basically brushed us off. Then, in the early hours of the next morning, I heard a series of distinct bangs from Mr. Goodwin's basement, like fists pounding on a wall. My imagination conjured images of trapped people, battered arms striking concrete, desperate to be heard. Enough was enough. By the time dawn broke, I'd made a decision. I told Dad we had to investigate that basement ourselves, break the lock if we must. Something was in there, something that needed help, or something that had to be confronted. He resisted at first, but the tension in his face told me he agreed. Mom was scared, but she said if we were going, we had better be careful. She suggested we wait until midday, bright sunshine, less chance of horrors creeping in the shadows. So, around noon, Dad and I marched next door. The back door was indeed still open. A stale breeze greeted us, smelling of rot and dust. The kitchen we entered was stripped of appliances, counters, thick with grime. Water stains along the ceiling. Dad's breath rasped in the silence. We crept through the house, each room bare except for ancient dust-laden junk, a broken chair in the living room, a moth-eaten curtain in a bedroom, the attic hatch slightly ajar. Every footstep echoed. But the real goal was the basement. At the end of a narrow hallway, we found a stout wooden door with a heavy padlock on the outside. Dad took a crowbar he'd brought and pried at the hasp. It took some force, but eventually the metal gave, the padlock clattering to the floor. The moment it fell, a gust of cold air wafted through the corridor, raising goosebumps on my skin. We exchanged glances. Then we opened that door. The stench hit us first, like old meat left to rot. I nearly gagged. Dad covered his mouth. A rickety set of wooden steps descended into gloom. We had flashlights, so we clicked them on, shining beams into the darkness. My heart pounded so hard I was sure Dad could hear it. Step by step, we went down, each board creaking ominously. The basement was larger than I expected, a low-ceilinged space with brick walls. Our flashlights revealed tangles of cobwebs, random junk scattered about, boxes, broken tables, a rusted metal bed frame. But that wasn't what made me freeze. Along one wall were shackles bolted to the brick, each cuff caked in something blackish-brown. Nearby lay a table covered in dark stains, an array of rusted tools, saws, pliers, hooks. My flashlight shook in my grip. Dad hissed, "Oh my God." The place looked like a torture chamber. The smell was overpowering now. I fought down bile, mind reeling. Then I heard a faint rattling noise from deeper in the basement. We turned the beams toward the far corner. There, in a patch of thick shadow, something moved. "Hello?" Dad called, voice trembling. No reply, just a soft scraping, like nails on concrete. We edged closer. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear. As the flashlight beams swept across the corner, we saw them, shapes hunched against the wall, half translucent. At first, I thought they were people. But no, they glowed faintly, as if lit from within by a sickly light. Spirits, ghosts, whatever you call them. Their eyes flicked open, glinting with a tortured awareness. One shape moaned, a hollow, raspy sound that shattered any logic I had left. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Dad choked back a cry, stepping in front of me protectively. The apparition struggled, as if still bound by unseen chains. I recognized the outline of a man with gaunt cheeks, a woman with twisted arms, a smaller figure that might have been a child. All stared at us with a pleading desperation. My thoughts careened, these must be the victims of whoever owned this house. Of Mr. Goodwin. Maybe he locked them here. Tortured them. And they never left. Suddenly, from the darkness behind those spirits, another figure emerged, taller, more solid. It wore a tattered cardigan, its face a slack mask of pallid flesh. Mr. Goodwin? Or what remained of him? His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his jaw hung crooked. An unholy hiss escaped him as he raised a bony hand, pointing at us. Dad tried to speak, maybe to reason or plead, but the figure lunged forward with impossible speed, crossing the basement in a flicker. I screamed. Dad swung the crowbar in reflex, passing it straight through the specter's body. The ghostly form shuddered, then reappeared a foot away, lips twisted in silent rage. The other spirits cowered or shrank back, as if terrified of this dominating presence. My flashlight began to flicker. In that strobe effect, I saw Mr. Goodwin's face contort, eyes rolling back. He opened his mouth wide, but no sound emerged, only a forceful blast of cold air that struck us like a gale. We stumbled, nearly losing our balance. Dad grabbed my arm, shouting, "We have to get out." I nodded frantically. But as we turned, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a thunderous crash, plunging us into near darkness. A collective moan rose from the corner, dozens of whispery voices layering, swirling. I sensed their pain, their desperation. Then Mr. Goodwin, his ghost, floated closer, blocking the stairs. The reek of decay intensified. I braced for an assault. But to my shock, the other spirits began drifting forward, eyes filled with raw fury, not at us, but at him. They seemed to unite, forming a cluster of luminous shapes. Goodwin's visage warped with alarm as they converged around him. He twisted, emitting that voiceless scream, thrashing in midair while the other ghosts latched onto him. My flashlight gave out, leaving the basement in total blackness except for the faint glow from the spirits themselves. For a moment, I glimpsed a swirling mass of phosphorescent shapes, a vortex of souls dragging Goodwin's form into the shadows. The temperature plummeted. Dad and I huddled, teeth chattering, as an eerie wind whipped around us. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The temperature eased. I fumbled for my phone, flicking on its flashlight. The basement was empty. No sign of the ghostly shapes, no sign of Mr. Goodwin's twisted spirit. The shackles, the stained tools, they were still there, but now silent, inert, stripped of menace. Even the stench of rot began to dissipate, replaced by stale dust. Dad found the basement stairs. The door at the top was ajar once more, as if unlatched from the inside. We scrambled up without another look. Outside, the sun was still shining. Leaves rustled in a gentle breeze. It felt surreal. We bolted back home, shaky and pale. Mom took one look at our faces and burst into tears. She must have known something horrific happened. Dad and I tried to explain, though words failed. How do you say you just witnessed ghosts? Tortured souls? A monstrous spirit that used to be your neighbor? We resolved to call the police again, but also an anonymous tip. We didn't want to mention the supernatural. We merely said we found evidence of a possible crime in Mr. Goodwin's basement, bones, shackles, tools. The police arrived, blocking off the house with yellow tape. Over the next week, forensic vans came and went, removing crates of who knew what from the basement. Rumor spread that multiple sets of remains were discovered. The local news ran a brief story about an unidentified mass grave in a suburban home. The strangest part, official records showed Mr. Goodwin died over 20 years ago. He'd apparently been quite old already, rumored to have a violent streak. No living heirs. The deed had never transferred. So who, or what, had we glimpsed in that yard weeks earlier? Or in the basement that day? We had no explanation. The house was declared a crime scene, pending further investigation. Eventually, condemnation notices were posted. People said it would be demolished. During the chaos, we never heard any more of those horrible noises. The nights turned silent, as if the trapped souls were finally at rest, or at least no longer bound to that basement. My nightmares persisted, though. I'd wake in a cold sweat, remembering the cluster of spirits tackling Goodwin's malevolent form, dragging him away. I liked to think they'd found a chance to exact vengeance or find freedom. Maybe the old man's ghost, that hateful presence, had been holding them there. With him gone, they could depart too. Weeks later, the property was leveled, turned into a vacant lot. Grass grew tall where the foundation once stood. We tried to get on with our lives. But I can't forget the sight of that ghost looming in the basement, the echo of those tortured shapes, the stench of blood and dust. Every so often, I catch Dad staring out the window, lost in thought. Mom avoids the topic entirely, as if speaking of it might lure the past back. Sometimes I wonder if a single shred of Goodwin's spirit lurks still, drifting aimlessly over that empty lot. Or if the souls he tormented remain, freed but unable to leave the place of their suffering. At night, when the wind howls, I think I hear faint chains rattling, or a soft moan. Then I tell myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know we confronted something terrible, something that defies rational explanation. If you ever move into a new neighborhood and notice a neighbor who never leaves his house, if you hear strange sounds from a basement next door, don't assume it's just a lonely old man or a faulty water heater. Some evils linger long after the mortal shell is gone, feeding off pain and secrecy. And if you're not careful, you might become another voice in that dreadful chorus echoing through the walls. So this is our warning, mine and my family's. Even well-kept suburbs can harbor unspeakable horrors behind neatly trimmed hedges and shuttered windows. We survived, but I can't say we came away unscathed. Late at night, I sometimes dream of that basement, the rusted chains, the flicker of ghostly shapes, and that one monstrous figure at their center. I see his dead eyes snapping toward me. I hear a silent scream. Then I wake, heart pounding, feeling thankful we escaped. But a part of me wonders if Mr. Goodwin's presence might find us again, no matter where we go. After all, he never truly left that house, not even in death. Some ghosts cling too tightly to the sins they committed and the torture they inflicted. They become inseparable from the very walls around them, refusing to let go until every last shred of their darkness is purged. And sometimes, even the walls can't contain them forever. Story number 3. When darkness moves in. I wish I could say that I noticed the strange man right away, but the truth is, the beginning was almost laughably ordinary. My name is Claire Davis. I live in a small, suburban town in Pennsylvania that's halfway between nowhere and the next place you've never heard of. Street after street of modest ranch homes and Cape Cods, big trees shading the sidewalks, a decent public school system, and not a whole lot else. It's the kind of place where new neighbors don't exactly arrive in droves, so when someone does move in, folks pay attention. I was no exception. But if I'd known then what I know now, I might have told my parents to skip town immediately, or at least installed every alarm system known to man. Instead, I let curiosity lull me into a sense of complacency, never suspecting that the man who moved in next door was something far more terrifying than any normal recluse. He showed up on a humid August evening, just as the sun had dipped below the horizon. I was in my living room, half watching a late-night talk show, when I heard a small commotion outside. Through the window, I spotted headlights sweeping across the vacant house next door, cutting bright arcs across the unkempt lawn. It had been empty for the better part of a year, the for sale sign leaning askew, so I assumed the real estate agent had finally found a buyer. That was good news for the neighborhood, right? Another family to fill out the block, maybe fix up the peeling paint on that old porch. I walked outside for a better view, the night air thick with crickets. A black van was parked along the curb, engine running. The driver's side door opened, and a tall figure emerged, overshadowed by the gloom. I waved reflexively. This was small-town courtesy, after all, but he didn't appear to notice me. He just stood by the van for a moment, maybe fiddling with something inside. Then he shut the door and headed toward the vacant house. I caught a glimpse of his profile, pale face, dark hair, sharp features. He wore a long-sleeved shirt despite the oppressive heat. He moved with an odd grace, quick but purposeful, and disappeared onto the porch without so much as a glance in my direction. Okay, I thought, maybe not the friendliest greeting, but he was probably tired from traveling. I shrugged and went back inside, telling myself I'd try again the next morning, maybe bring him a plate of brownies if I felt up to being neighborly. That never happened. The next morning, the van was still there in the driveway, but the man was nowhere to be seen. By noon, when I checked again, the van had vanished. The for sale sign was yanked out of the ground, leaning against the porch. Yet all the windows of the house were dark. The locked front door showed no sign of life. Several days rolled by in that same fashion. Some evenings, I'd noticed a black van parked outside well after sunset, but by dawn, it was gone. I never caught sight of the new neighbor in broad daylight, never saw him strolling down the sidewalk or unloading groceries. It was like the house was vacant by day, inhabited by night. I began to wonder if he worked a graveyard shift or was just a hardcore insomniac. My parents, who lived with me, I was in my early 20s, juggling college courses remotely while saving money by staying at home, figured it was none of our business. Dad said maybe the guy was a night watchman or a trucker, something that required unconventional hours. Mom worried about the property values, seeing as the lawn next door was turning brown and scraggly. Meanwhile, I was mostly just curious. That curiosity turned to unease one evening when I was taking the trash out at around midnight. The air smelled of cut grass and lingering barbecue from some neighbor's party. I heard footsteps behind me, soft but unmistakable. I turned and saw him, my new neighbor, standing a few yards away on the sidewalk, as though he'd materialized from the shadows. His silhouette was elongated under the street lamp. It made me jump, nearly dropping the trash bag. "Sorry," I mumbled, mustering a polite smile. "Didn't see you there." He nodded in an almost jerky way, lips pressed in. Under the faint glow of the street lamp, I saw that his skin was indeed extremely pale, the kind of pallor you get when you've spent months, maybe years, without sunlight. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He wore black slacks, black shoes, and a button-down shirt that somehow seemed untouched by the humidity. I stuck out a hand. "I'm Claire. From next door." His gaze flicked to my hand, then back to my face. He offered a slow, measured smile that looked about as genuine as a plastic Halloween mask. Finally, after an awkward beat, he gripped my hand with an icy palm. It felt like he'd been holding a glass of ice water. "Hello, Claire," he said in a low voice. His accent was neutral, maybe a hint of something foreign. "I'm Richard." The hesitation in his self-introduction was odd, as if he'd had to think about the name. "Pleased to meet you." He let go of my hand quickly, almost recoiling. I tried to mask my discomfort. I didn't realize you moved in. We've been neighbors for a week or so, right?" I could feel the conversation faltering, but politeness compelled me to keep going. "Must be busy, settling in?" His eyes flitted toward his house. "Yes. Busy," he said. Then he turned the corners of his mouth upward in a semblance of a grin. "Work keeps me out late. Sorry if I disturbed you." "Not at all," I replied. "I just wanted to say hi. My parents and I are next door if you ever need anything." He nodded again, that same stiff movement. "Thank you. Have a good night." Then, without further ado, he pivoted and strode toward his house, disappearing onto the porch. I stood there for a moment, unsettled. Something about him felt off. Not just the chill of his skin or the lack of expression in his eyes, but a sense that he was going through the motions of being human. I brushed it off as me letting my imagination run wild. Over the following weeks, I noticed patterns. Richard's black van would appear after dusk, headlights cutting through the dark, then vanish well before sunrise. I never saw him outside during the day, not even to grab the mail or water the lawn. The curtains in his windows remained drawn, not a crack of daylight seeping in. Once or twice, I thought I glimpsed him through the living room window at night, his silhouette flitting by, but whenever I looked more closely, the shape was gone. A rumor started circulating in the neighborhood that he was terminally ill, allergic to sunlight, or maybe recovering from some skin condition. People gossiped, but no one confronted him. Everyone basically left him alone, which was easy enough. He didn't exactly invite company. On the rare occasions I spotted him on the sidewalk after midnight, I'd wave. He'd nod. That was it. No small talk, no explanation. Then came the night I saw him digging. It was around 2 in the morning. My sleep schedule was terrible. I was up late finishing an online course project. I happened to glance out my bedroom window, which overlooked Richard's backyard. In the pale glow of a waning moon, I saw a figure out there, stooped low, shovel in hand. My heart skipped. Could it be a gardener working at such an hour? The idea was laughable. I watched as he drove the shovel into the earth, tossing dirt aside in a steady rhythm. After a few minutes, he paused, scanning the yard as if making sure no one was watching. I ducked behind my curtain, pulse pounding. Curiosity ate at me, but so did fear. What on earth was he doing? Burying trash? Burying a pet? I'd never seen him with a dog or cat. My mind drifted to darker possibilities, drugs, stolen goods, or something far worse. For a moment, I considered sneaking out to investigate, but my skin prickled at the thought of confronting Richard alone in the dead of night while he dug a hole. So I watched from the relative safety of my window. The hole grew deeper. Eventually, he stopped, brushed himself off, and disappeared inside. I told myself it was nothing. People bury stuff. Maybe it was a time capsule. Maybe old furniture pieces. Except it became a pattern. Every few nights, I'd see him digging, sometimes for hours, sometimes for only a brief interval. The holes moved around the yard, as though he was searching for the perfect spot. I'd crane my neck trying to see if he was burying something, but the darkness and distance made it impossible to be sure. A creeping dread took root in my stomach. I found excuses to ignore it. I had schoolwork, chores, normal life to worry about. Then, early one morning as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint scream. Just a single note of terror that cut through the air and then vanished. I jolted upright, adrenaline surging. Could it have come from Richard's yard? I rushed to the window, scanning the darkness. The yard lay still, no sign of him. My eyes darted to the newly disturbed patches of earth. My imagination conjured the worst scenario. Was he murdering someone out there, burying them? That was insane, right? People don't just murder neighbors in quiet suburbs. But that single, chilling scream lingered in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. The next afternoon, I forced myself to check. My parents were out, so I wandered over to Richard's yard in broad daylight. The grass was patchy and dying, a few stray tools lay near the back step. It was the first time I'd been in his yard when he wasn't around. I found 2 spots where the earth looked recently turned. They were about 6 feet long, rectangular mounds. My stomach dropped. They looked disturbingly like graves. I crouched, pressing a hand to the soil. It was damp, the ground still loose. I nearly vomited at the realization that if I dug, I might find bones. Or a body. Or who knew what. Fear warred with moral obligation. Should I call the police right then? But what if it was a weird landscaping project? Accused a man of murder based on weird behavior and my midnight imagination? I took pictures with my phone, snapping them as quickly as I could, hands trembling. Then I fled, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. That night, I resolved to keep watch. If Richard was truly burying bodies, I had to know for certain before involving the cops. So I stationed myself at my window after midnight, lights off, phone in hand. The moon was just a sliver, forcing me to rely mostly on the faint glow from a distant street lamp. Around 1 a.m., I saw headlights on the street, Richard's van, creeping along. He parked and carried something large from the back of the van. It looked roughly the size of a person, wrapped in a tarp or blanket. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. He was lugging it across the yard to a fresh patch of earth. The shape hung limply, as if it were a body. My entire body shook. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911, but I hesitated. Fear paralyzed me. If he was truly a killer, what would he do if the police arrived? There was no telling how dangerous he was. I decided to record, instead, snapping a few grainy photos, my heart in my throat. He lowered the bundle into the hole, then grabbed his shovel and began covering it with dirt. I felt sick, hot tears gathering in my eyes. This was real. A murderer lived next door, burying bodies in his backyard like some macabre gardener. I considered screaming, banging on the window to frighten him off. But I was terrified he might spot me, target me next. So I stayed silent, trembling, as he methodically patted down the soil. He paused once, lifting his head, as though sniffing the air. Even from my window, I felt his gaze brushed across my house. I ducked lower, heart pounding. After a tense moment, he returned to his work, eventually slipping inside under the cloak of darkness. I barely slept. My mind spun with horrifying questions. Who was he killing? Why? Where did he find them? Could they be runaways, hitchhikers, or random victims? I pictured him prowling the highways at night, luring unsuspecting strangers into his van. My thoughts turned to the rumors of him only appearing after sunset. Was it just a serial killer quirk? Or something else? The next day, I marched into the police station, phone in hand, ready to show them my photos. The local cops took my statement, but their skepticism was tangible. My pictures were blurry, indefinite lumps in the night. The fresh dirt could be yard work. They said they'd check it out. But I left feeling an impending sense of doom, like I'd done too little, too late. I waited for hours that night, expecting sirens. None came. The morning after, I called the station, but the officer in charge told me they'd knocked on Richard's door, got no answer, found no immediate evidence of wrongdoing, and left a note asking him to contact them. A powerless fury filled me. I was certain something monstrous was happening, but nobody believed me. That evening, I decided to wait behind my own house, as close to Richard's property line as I dared, phone in hand. If he hauled another body, I'd film a video, something undeniable. The hours crawled. Around midnight, a breeze rustled the leaves, sending a shiver down my spine. The yard beyond remained silent, the windows dark. Then, about an hour later, I heard a low rumble of an engine. Richard's van. My heart pounded. This was it. I crouched behind a shrub, peering over the fence. The van's headlights went dark. Richard emerged, tall silhouette gliding across the yard. He opened the van's rear doors, rummaged for a moment, then pulled something out. This time, the shape wasn't as large, but it was still a wrapped form. Perhaps a smaller victim, or maybe multiple parts. My stomach lurched. I raised my phone, hit record, hands shaking so badly I prayed it wouldn't blur. He carried the bundle to a fresh patch of earth he'd dug earlier in the day. Yes, I'd heard the faint scraping from my living room. He knelt, setting the package down carefully. Instead of burying it immediately, he unwrapped it. The moonlight caught something pale, like a limb. My breath caught in my throat. It was definitely a person, unconscious, or maybe dead. My phone screen, though, was too dark to show details. I zoomed in, but the image was barely discernible. Then, as if sensing my presence, Richard lifted his head. I froze. He sniffed the air again, that same predatory motion. My pulse thundered. He peered in my direction, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Suddenly, I saw his lips curl, baring teeth. Not normal teeth, but elongated canines, like an animal's fangs. My entire being went cold. A horrifying realization slammed into me: he was no ordinary killer. He was something else, something that only roamed at night, that needed a place to hide the remains of his victims. The legends of vampires I'd always laughed off now seemed all too plausible. Before I could process the shock, he vanished from sight. Gone, as though he'd never been there. I gaped at the spot, phone still rolling. A second later, he reappeared, right beside the fence. I yelped, stumbling backward, dropping my phone. In the faint moonlight, I glimpsed his face up close for the first time. His skin was ghastly pale, eyes burning with an unholy light, and yes, 2 elongated fangs protruded from his upper jaw. A rancid breath exhaled from between parted lips, carrying the coppery tang of blood. Claire, he whispered, voice deep and resonant, as if laced with centuries of secrets. You shouldn't be here. I tried to scramble away, but he lunged with supernatural speed, reaching over the fence. One claw-like hand seized my wrist, cold and merciless. I screamed, thrashing. He pulled me forward with inhuman strength, nearly dragging me over the fence. My mind flashed with the image of me ending up in one of those holes, my body drained and buried. Then, a floodlight snapped on from my parents' yard, motion sensor, triggered by our struggle. The bright beam illuminated Richard's gaunt face. He hissed, releasing me as if burned, covering his eyes. I tumbled backward onto my lawn, panting. He reeled away, cloak of shadows swirling about him. For a split second, I thought I glimpsed regret or anger in his expression. Then he retreated to his yard in a blur, scooping up the limp body and vanishing into the darkness near his back door. I lay there, trembling, hard hammered to pieces. The harsh floodlight glared overhead. My phone was somewhere in the grass. I scrambled to find it, half expecting Richard to pounce again. But he was gone. The yard next door was silent, as though nothing had happened. I stumbled inside, tears streaming, my parents rushing to meet me. I babbled the story of the vampire, the fangs, the body. They looked aghast, torn between wanting to comfort me and not believing a word. But my horror was genuine, my wrist bruised by that iron grip. Dad glanced outside but saw no sign of Richard. When I tried to show them my phone's footage, my heart sank. The video was black, lurching, my camera capturing only fleeting shapes. The audio had mostly my own ragged breathing. Nothing conclusive. I realized with sinking dread that I had no solid proof. The police had already dismissed my concerns before. And telling them I believed my neighbor was a vampire? That would earn me a one-way ticket to a psychiatric evaluation. We barricaded ourselves that night, checking every lock. Dawn arrived, a relief for me. Vampires, if that's really what he was, presumably couldn't roam in daylight. But what was I supposed to do next? Move away, uproot my life, just because an undead creature lived next door? The alternative was to live in constant fear, never going outside after dusk. That was no way to exist. Over the next few days, I avoided leaving the house at night. I kept curtains drawn, lights on. Each morning, I peered out at Richard's yard. He'd obviously filled in the hole that he'd started. The only evidence was fresh earth. If a corpse lay beneath, it was hidden well. The police, having no reason to suspect a vampire, never returned. The rest of the neighborhood went about their routines, oblivious to the monster among them. Then, one evening, I saw a note slipped under our front door. Handwritten, the letters neat and old-fashioned. It read, "I apologize for my behavior. Let us speak. Tonight, midnight, by the fence." A chill swept through me. Part of me wanted to tear it up, pretend I never saw it. But a strange compulsion tugged at me. Could he possibly want to explain? Or was he luring me out for an easy kill? Midnight found me trembling in the backyard, a large crucifix in one hand, borrowed from my grandma's old trunk, and a flashlight in the other. My parents were inside, unaware of what I was doing. I decided if I didn't return within 5 minutes, I told them to call the police. I perched near the fence, hard hammering. Minutes ticked by. The street was silent, no sign of the black van. Finally, a whisper drifted from the other side. "Claire." I stiffened, shining my flashlight through the fence slats. He stood there, pale and stiff, eyes reflecting the beam. "Stay back," I hissed, brandishing the crucifix. He lifted his hands, palm out in an oddly placating gesture. "I don't mean you harm. I only did what I must to survive." His voice sounded pained. "You wouldn't understand." I wanted to scream at him. Survive by murdering innocent people? By burying them in your yard? Instead, I forced out, "You're a vampire." Even saying it felt ludicrous. "You kill people." His gaze lowered. "I do what I must. My condition, it's a curse of sorts. I never wanted to be this way." "Bull!" I snapped, anger rising. "You murdered those people. I saw you bury them. His expression twisted in anguish. I can't change what I am. I've tried not to kill, but thirst drives me. If I leave the bodies in the open, suspicion grows, hunts me down. I had no choice but to hide them. I gaped at him, my flashlight shaking. The very idea that this being was trying to rationalize his crimes made me ill. So you're a monster, basically. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. If that's how you see it. But I never wanted to harm you, Claire. That night, you spied on me. I panicked. I only feed on strangers, drifters, criminals I find on the highways. I try not to kill good people. You must believe me. My mind reeled. He'd basically admitted to being some twisted vigilante predator, draining criminals? It sounded insane, but the sorrow in his voice seemed genuine. Still, he was a murderer. My voice trembled with anger. Then what do you want from me now? His eyes flicked to the crucifix, wariness evident. I wanted to ask you to keep silent. The police won't believe your story, but if you spread rumors, it complicates things. I can leave soon, find another place, bury my secrets. You can remain safe. I stared at him, repulsed. He was asking me to let him roam free, continuing his cycle of killings in another town. My knuckles whitened around the crucifix. And if I refuse? A flicker of something dark crossed his face, but then he sighed. Then I'll vanish anyway. And you'll be called a liar or a fool. Either way, my existence continues. And your burden remains. Tears burned my eyes. I hated him. Hated the reality that I had no easy recourse. The law would never convict him on vampire grounds. The neighborhood didn't suspect a thing. 1,000 angry retorts swirled in my head, but I found myself stammering, "You're a monster." A cold-blooded, inhuman thing. He inclined his head. Yes. I am. Then, with a final, hollow look, he turned and melted into the darkness. I stood there, adrenaline crashing, tears on my cheeks. After a moment, I realized the yard was empty. He was gone. The next morning, I saw the black van was missing. Days passed without sign of him. No digging, no sightings. The newly turned earth remained in his yard, a silent testament to horrors. One afternoon, a moving truck arrived, but it was empty. No one got out. It left after a few minutes. I guessed it was some charade he used to obscure his departure. Sure enough, that evening, the house next door was dark, silent, apparently abandoned again. A week later, a for sale sign reappeared, hammered in at a crooked angle. The real estate agent confessed to my mom that the owner, whoever he was, had canceled the purchase, left behind no contact info. The neighbor from hell had vanished as mysteriously as he'd arrived. To this day, I sometimes wonder if I made a mistake not calling the cops again, or arming myself with wooden stakes, holy water, whatever might put an end to his reign of terror. But how could I, a single woman, realistically fight a vampire? The notion was absurd, suicidal. And yet the guilt gnaws at me. He's out there somewhere, haunting another nightbound existence, burying fresh victims in another unsuspecting backyard. I keep the memory of his cold, inhuman grip on my wrist as a reminder. Evil can take many forms, but it thrives best when it's hidden in the shadows, shielded by disbelief and silence. The holes in that yard have been filled, the grass grown back. Another buyer might move in soon, clueless about the horror that once lurked on that property. As for me, I keep my curtains shut after sundown, checking locks obsessively. Sleep doesn't come easy. I see his gaunt face, those predatory eyes. Hear that calm, regretful voice, "I never wanted to harm you." The worst part? I sometimes catch myself almost believing him. Maybe he was just a creature damned by a curse, trying in some twisted way to limit the harm he did. Or maybe that was a lie to ease his conscience, if he had one left at all. Either way, I know the truth. He was a killer, a monster who only ventured out at night, burying evidence of his crimes in the cold earth. In my nightmares, I watch him dig hole after hole, moonlight reflecting on the blade of his shovel. I try to scream, but no sound emerges. He lifts his head, sniffs the air, fangs glinting, and leaps across the yard in a single bound. Then I wake up sweating, heart pounding. Every new day is a small mercy, another chance to breathe under the sun he can never face. But at night, every passing car, every shifting shadow, makes my pulse race with old terror. Because I know, somewhere out there, he's hunting again, carrying away another tarped body, burying them under starlight. That's my story. Believe it or not, but if you ever see a neighbor who only appears after dark, who keeps odd hours and has fresh dirt piles in the backyard, you might want to pack up and leave. This world is bigger and darker than most folks realize, and some nightmares hide behind the most mundane front doors. If you see them digging, or if you catch a glimpse of eyes glowing in the moonlight, run. Don't do what I did, trying to gather evidence and reason with a monster. Some evils you can't reason with. Some evil just has to be escaped. And if you're lucky, you'll live to warn someone else.